Hello everyone and welcome. I am KM Weiland. I run the writing website helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com, and I've written a couple books you may have heard of, such as Structuring Your Novel and Creating Character Arcs. And today we're going to be talking about what is very possibly the single most important element of any successful story. And that is the lie the character believes. So why is the lie the character believes so important, and what is it? So the lie the character believes, very simply, is just a mistaken or limited perspective that the character holds at the beginning of the story, which will be challenged as they go through the plot. And in some stories, they will overcome it in exchange for a thematic truth, which is a broader and more expanded perspective of themselves or the world around them. In other stories, they may fail to do this, and in which case they'd be arcing negatively, probably into a worse lie. Or it's also possible that they start out in possession of the truth, and it's the world around them that represents the lie, and they are able to use their broader understanding of something to bring more refinement and calibration to the characters and the world around them. But fundamentally, it is this push-pull, this conflict between the lie and the truth that, first of all, creates character arc. It creates change within the character. And therefore, by doing that, is also something that drives plot and is driven by the events of the plot. So this is something that I discuss in depth in my book, Creating Character Arcs, because as I say, this is the foundation of character arc. So if you want more information on this than just what we're going to talk about in this 20-minute video, then you can check that out. And I will also leave lots of resources from my site down below, as always. So first of all, let's just talk about what is the lie and what is the truth. So I like these terms because they are very black and white, and they immediately give you a sense of what the deeper archetypal purpose of them are within story. But it's important to understand that both can be very relative within the story, and that fundamentally all they are is that the lie is this limited perspective. It's something that the character believes to be true about themselves or the world, and it may be true to a certain point, but it's limited. And the events of the story, whatever's happening that's asking them to sort of step up within the plot that you've created for your story, is challenging this limited perspective and basically saying, like, this isn't good enough. This isn't going to get the job done. There's more to it. And the truth, the thematic truth, stands in opposition to that as something that the story is positing is more true about the world than this limited perspective with which the character starts out. So I call it the thematic truth because ultimately theme in a story is whatever the story ultimately is trying, consciously or unconsciously to prove about reality. So sometimes this is going to be very explicit and the character, learns the truth they learn is some sort of aphorism or axiom, like the golden rule or something like that. But sometimes it's never outright stated within the story, and it's just proven through what is effective in the character's actions as they move through the plot. So in a very plot-driven story, the truth may be, simply you need to learn kung fu in order to defeat the bad guy. Something like that. That's just, they need to learn this new way of being in the world, this new skill. Or, it could be something like you need to learn that Darth Vader's your father. You need to perceive something that is literally a mistake about how you are interacting with the information that you need in order to reach your plot goal. And then again, in other stories, it's something that is, much more personal and can be hard to define sometimes even in concrete terms. Things, like believing that you're worthy or you're lovable or something like that. There's a broad range here, but ultimately whatever the truth is in your story, and therefore whatever the theme ultimately is, has to do with what the story is proving works. It's proving that this is a more effective way of thinking about the world, a more effective way of being in the world, which is then proven by how the character is able to move toward their plot goal and whether or not they achieve it. So obviously, if they're effective in reaching their plot goal by the end, then that would indicate that they were able to overcome the lie, the limitations of that, and move into this more expanded and effective perspective of the truth. Whereas, they may, if they're in a negative change arc, they may ultimately end up ineffective in the plot in some way. Even if they're able to gain their plot goal, there's some sort of, moral failure, moral defeat that we understand is in that their actions in the plot were not effective because they were not able to grasp the truth. So even in stories in which, the truth doesn't win, so to speak, like the characters are not able to use it in order to get what they want or to be more whole within themselves and the story world, it still is proving this truth by the very fact that they're not happy or they're not effective or that we understand they've fatally compromised their integrity in some way. So the story as a whole, every story, whether it's very plot driven or very character driven, will ultimately revolve around some level of this conflict between lie and truth, between a limited way of being and a more expanded and effective way of being within the story. The way that character arc specifically works is you start out with a character believing some lie, some limited perspective, depending on, what you're trying to explore in your story. It can be many different things. But they will start out with this limited perspective. And as the plot kind of rolls into view, right, something happens, the inciting event comes online, and their reality begins to change, right? That's the whole point of why you're beginning this story where it is, or why you're telling this story at all. Something's happening, something's changing within the character's reality, and that is going to challenge their perspective of the world and themselves up to this point. It's no longer going to be as effective as it once may have been. And so there begins to be kind of this inner conflict that the character experiences as they try to grow into the person they need to be to meet these plot challenges that are coming at them. So generally speaking, the first act, the first 25% of the story is where you're really going to be exploring the lie. This is where you're exploring what this looks like for the character, how it may have been very effective for them up until this point, and also how now that these, things are starting to happen, changes are coming, they're developing a new plot goal that they need to go after for whatever reason. This is where you can start exploring the dysfunction of the lie and why it's no longer going to prove effective as they move forward, why they need to change, and in essence, why they need to accept that call to adventure to change in order to be effective as they move through the actions of the plot. So as they enter the second act, after the first plot point, they enter, that threshold through the doorway of no return, and they enter the full-on conflict of the second act. That first half of the second act is very much about the characters kind of reacting to everything that's changing. They're a little bit off balance. They don't know where they're at. And the primary reason for this is because they don't have an understanding of the truth yet, right? They're still trying to operate off of their old mindset, which is the lie. And how can they, do that when what has been their perspective and their mode of being up until this point actually isn't effective to meet these new challenges? So it's kind of what I call a grumpy bumpy period where you're like just growing and everything just feels uncomfortable and you don't quite know what's going on. You're maybe not completely embracing the process. Like you'd rather, just stick with your old way of being and, keep pretending that, you have a hammer, so all the world's a nail. So you just keep hammering away at it. That's kind of this point of this story, as the character is meeting challenges that are not nails, that are bigger than, what they've ever encountered before. And it slowly starts, to dawn on them, like, the old way of doing this is not going to work. And so this is a time in the plot where they'll be running into defeats, kind of, maybe not definitively, but they'll try to use, their old perspective, their old way of being. And it doesn't completely work. It's not completely effective. And so they have to adjust. They have to learn as they go. And, so they slowly begin to sort of explore the limitations of the lie, and it begins to dawn like maybe this isn't the end all be all of how to see things. And that will bring them to the midpoint, which is defined by what I call the moment of truth. And this is a moment where, something big happens and the accumulation of everything that the character has been learning up to this point leads them to the ability to really see the opposing viewpoint, to see the truth of this story and how effective that it could help them be in getting what they need. Basically, it's like a light bulb goes on and they're like, oh, this is what I have to do to get what I want. And And in some stories, it's as simple as that. It can just be simply a plot revelation, like, oh, we need to go, find the plans to the bad guy's evil base. And that's going to let us get what we want. So something very practical and action-based. But specifically within theme and within character arc, it's also something that is a deeper understanding and expansion within the person. They have to be able to see something in a way they've never seen it before and to expand into that. It's challenging them, to become a new version of themselves in some ways. So from this point on, they can take that truth that they've gleaned at the midpoint and move into the second half of the second act, which is very much an action phase. They're able to move out of kind of that hapless reaction where they don't know what they're doing or quite how to get it done, and they become more and more effective as they go. Now, it's also likely that the antagonistic force, whatever that is in your story, will also be pushing harder and getting bigger. So it's not necessarily that the protagonist is winning in the conflict, but they are learning how to become much more effective by using, a more accurate understanding of the conflict and of themselves in that conflict. That's going to lead them. Okay, so one more thing I need to say about that part of the story is that they recognize the truth at the midpoint. They do not yet, however, reject the lie. So they, basically get this shiny new toy and they're like, oh, wow, I totally get it. This is amazing. I'm going to be awesome from this point on. But they're not yet willing to totally give up who they were before or their old modes of being, and this could be for ego reasons. They're very identified with whatever it is, but it could also be just survival. It's like, this is how I've always survived. I can't let this go yet. And that's not necessarily, an inaccurate perspective on their part because they haven't fully integrated the new way of being. So if they just let go of the old way, then, too soon, then it could be very destructive depending on what it is. Throughout the second half of the second act, after the midpoint, they're again going to be experiencing this inner conflict between truth and between lie as they begin to move more and more into the truth. But it's still this conflict of like, how can I hold these two perspectives or ways of being at the same time? And it becomes more and more clear that they are in fact incompatible and that they probably are going to have to let go of the lie completely at some point. And that is going to lead them to the third plot point, which is the low moment. It symbolizes death, rebirth within the story. And specifically on the character level of character arc, what's happening here is that if the character is to succeed in achieving a positive change arc and embracing the truth, then the person they were, the person who believed in the lie, is going to have to die. That identity is kaput at this point if they're going to succeed. And then they're going to have to be reborn into this person who has fully integrated and embraced and understands the truth of the story. And this can, I think in the most poignant stories, this usually is a very complex moment. Because we hear a lie and we hear truth and we think, well, obviously we want the truth. Why would we hang on to the lie? But in our own lives, and therefore what we want to see mirrored in story, is it isn't this simple, right? The lie has been like our old friend. It's been this limited perspective has been something that has been effective for us to some degree. And therefore, we're kind of loath to give it up. And we're identified with it on an ego level to some degree. So it does feel like I'm giving up myself. I'm giving up a part of myself, my old way of being. And in a story, it's definitive. Whatever you're dealing with is something very definitive. So there is a death of some part of the character and therefore a grief and a very real desire to hang on to that and not to let it go. The character is met with a moment where their refusal up to this point or their inability to completely give up the lie will lead them to, what seems maybe like a victory at first, but it is ultimately a defeat of some sort. And it becomes very clear that, the defeat is the consequence of their refusal to completely give up the lie, and that they will not be able to overcome it or reverse it or finally get what they want or become who they want to be unless they finally and fully grapple with this old identity and give up the lie. This, can be dramatized very quickly. It doesn't have to be this huge, trip into the underworld of the character's psyche where they're wrestling with these parts of themselves. But it is something that usually needs to be hit full on. Like, you don't want to just brush over it because this is arguably the most powerful, potentially powerful moment within your entire story, because this is it. This is where the character's arc is decided. Are they going to be able to do this? Are they going to be able to transition into someone who believes in and embraces and embodies this story's new truth? From that point on, we enter the third act and the climax. Now, the third act, a good portion of the third act often is taken up with this inner conflict and this grappling. And then the climax will start about halfway through the third act. And by the time they get to the climax, it may not be crystal clear in their own mind exactly what's happening or what they're going to do, but they will have integrated the truth if they're going to integrate it within this story, and rejected the lie. And it's unacted upon, it's unproven at this point, but it's there. It's ready for them to do whatever they're going to do in the climax, to make that climactic decision, to be a stand for the story's truth, to use the story's truth to allow them to be effective as they move against the antagonistic force or toward their plot goal, whatever that may be. So by the time they get to the climax, the conflict is pretty much decided, and what's left is for them to act upon it, to prove it to themselves and to readers, and to see, what happens when I embrace the truth, or vice versa, what happens when I reject it? What are the consequences either way? That is character arc. That is the dance between the lie and the truth within a story. And this is such an important foundation to understand within story theory and story structure. Character arc and story structure are very much connected, right? You can't have plot without character, and vice versa. So this transformation and this conflict, this ongoing conflict between lie and truth, is very important to plot as much as it is to character, and will be found in any type of story, even if it's one that doesn't go very deep into the character arc. It's not sketching a huge dramatic character arc, or it doesn't spend a lot of time on it. The underpinnings are still there and exist within the plot structure. So just really quickly, let's close out with just some examples of some different kinds of lies, because again, that the terminology lie and truth are very black and white, right? And I like them for that reason, because they, it's like, you can see what they are. You can understand kind of their dynamic within the story. But in fact, they are not that black and white. They are very, very relative, right? Particularly, I think we hear truth, and it's like, we think ultimate truth, right? And that can be what you're dealing with in your story. But in most stories, all you're dealing with is a viewpoint that is better than the lie, right? And so the lie, fundamentally, what is that? What is the lie? So we have aspects where it can be a literal lie that the character is dealing with at some point, at some level. Maybe they were lied to, maybe they were adopted and they were told that they, were somebody's biological children. That's a lie. Or something else. It could be on a grander scope where you're dealing with a government conspiracy or a cover-up. Murder investigations, in essence, are a search for the truth to overcome the lie, which is really just a lack of information about who the killer may be, right? And that's a very plot-based example of how this might work. In other stories, it's very likely to be something deeper. And also it can be these, it is a surface example of how it's playing out in the world. And also this deeper wrestling within the character of a misconception they hold either about the world around them. Perhaps they have a view that a certain, type of people are evil, and they have to overcome that. Or perhaps they have a view, that people in general are unsafe, or something like that. And they have to overcome that view in order to be able to be, for instance, more effective in a relationship. But it can also be a misconception they hold about themselves, right? Or they can hold them, together. Because very often, when we have a view about the world, it's because we are projecting something from within ourselves out there onto other people in the world around us. So ultimately, at its most psychologically valuable, the lie the character believes is something that they haven't come to a wholeness within themselves. It's a shadow piece, right? Which is something I've talked about in my recent course this year about shadow archetypes, and how we, really the inner conflict within character arc is this wrestling with the potential that we have within ourselves to claim this new truth, and the shadows that underlie that would pull us back, hold us back, and or pervert that new power basically into something that isn't positive or integrated for ourselves or others. So at its deepest level, the lie the character believes is usually some belief they hold about themselves and how they operate in the world. That they aren't good enough, that they aren't worthy, that that they need a certain status symbol in order to be okay. I mean, there's many, many examples, and I talk about this in my book, Creating Character Arcs. So you can look there for some more examples. But ultimately, just look at your own life, right? Because we have this arc from lie to truth constantly within our own lives. And sometimes we can look at really big epochs within our lives where, we completely changed our mind, or, our mind was blown by a totally new perspective, or change was demanded because our life circumstances changed, as they do in a story. And we had no choice but to adapt and to grow in order to survive and to meet those levels. But it also happens, pretty much every day on a lesser level, where we're learning. Every time you learn something new, possibly while you're watching this video, you are, broadening your perspective and, trading a lie or a limited perspective for a new truth or a broader perspective. So just in examining how that works for you on little and big levels within your own life can help you understand how this psychological arc works within story, and ultimately why it's so powerful and poignant, because what story is doing is mirroring this, this truth of what we experience, within our own lives, and therefore helping us understand our process, as well as perhaps, helping us see specific perspectives that we haven't considered or integrated more clearly as we move through the worlds of different people's stories. This is one of my favorite topics. Like I say, I think it's very possibly the single most important thing to understand about story if you want to write a really powerful story that works. So I hope that was enjoyable for all of you. And I hope that you will stick around for the next video. And if you'd like to stay in touch with me until then, the best way to do that is to sign up for my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. I put out a lengthy blog post and podcast every Monday, so you can stay up to date with those even when the videos aren't coming out. And if you'd also like to connect with me on Instagram at author KM Weiland, I post fun stuff over there, thoughts and musings and epiphanies about writing and life that I don't post anywhere else. So I hope to see you around, and until then, happy writing.